It's a real honor and pleasure to be invited and the featured speaker today. Um, Let me say a little bit about my background so you understand where I'm coming from. The study of trafficking, illicit trafficking of networks in general, is a very interdisciplinary effort. And so we come from different places intellectually and we use different languages. I am an economist by training. Economics very heavily uses the language of mathematics, but I understand that this is an interdisciplinary audience. So I'm going to try to convert some of the concepts into language that I think may be a little more accessible across the disciplines. And so if you have any questions, please, as Stuart said, you're more than welcome to ask them and I'll try my best to answer them. So the title of the presentation today is Using Economic Principles to Identify and Understand Drug Trafficking Networks. And I'm going to explain in a few minutes the philosophy of this. It's driven by economic principles. Knowledge of drug flows is a very important input into drug control efforts. If you know how drugs are flowing, law enforcement, but also efforts to try to prevent consumption or production of the drugs at the beginning and the end of these supply chains can be more effective if we know how these drugs are flowing. This knowledge requires information about the location and movements of illegal drugs. And of course, a basic problem is because these drugs are illegal, people who engage in the trafficking of these drugs are really not going to voluntarily make the information available. So accurate information about drug flows is quite scarce. And one of the things I found very surprising about 10 to 15 years ago when I started thinking about these problems is there is a lot of information out there, some of it of an economic nature, that is not yet being optimally used. And even though some of that information is inaccurate, it's noisy, if you will, it can be quite useful in understanding drug markets and drug trafficking networks. So what I'm going to strive to do today is give you an example, a series of examples of how we can exploit the information inherent in economic data to figure out how drugs are being trafficked. Okay? So the basic premise of this presentation is that economic data on prices, quality, primarily purity, and quantities, so the amount of drugs that are being seized, these data actually contain signals about how drugs flow across space. And we can exploit that information to get a sharper picture of what's happening. So the objective of my project, which has now gone on for the better part of a decade, is to develop and test a broad framework for surveillance of trafficking of illegal drugs using economic data. We're going to use basic concepts from economics, an area of analysis called network analysis that straddles multiple disciplines, including engineering, sociology, and computer science, and statistics. So the strategy is going to be to examine and use data on the prices of drugs, on seizures, on their purity, to try to infer flows of illegal drugs across regions, across space, across geographic space. So some of the selected examples that I'm going to show you in the presentation include how we can think about city-to-city flows of drugs like cocaine. We've written another paper on MDMA, ecstasy. The same source of data can be used to look at methamphetamine and other types of drugs as well. The other example I'm going to show you is a cross-jurisdictional set of studies on country-to-country flows of heroin in Europe. We'll also look at cocaine flows in Europe. One other thing I'd like to add, and this is a relatively recent project. We're also looking at data now on prices of cocaine at various stages of production in Colombia. And we're beginning to try to get a picture of how cocaine is trafficked within Colombia before it is exported for consumption worldwide.